when that ammonia is applied, it reacts with soil moisture and is converted into ammonium ion, which is relatively immobile. However, a good portion of that can be lost as volatilization. And as you can see, there's quite a few reactions that contribute to the formation of first of hydroxylamine, and then to nitrite, and eventually to nitrate. Nitrate is the form of nitrogen that is most mobile, and also is the one that's most prone to be taken up by crops. So what is this vadose zone that we've been studying? Well, it's the interval between the crop root zone and the water table. Very often when we do a soil test, we measure nitrate-nitrogen in terms of parts per million or micrograms per gram. And that's what this graph shows, the concentration of dry weight nitrate-nitrogen in parts per million below the root zone and down to the water table. If we convert that dry weight nitrate-nitrogen to a pore water equivalent using the moisture content, we can see that we have pretty high concentrations of nitrate in the soil pore water immediately below the crop root zone, and especially in areas where we have a high groundwater table. At this particular location, it was around 18 feet below the surface. We can connect very quickly the pore water nitrate concentrations with that in the groundwater. That red bar is the 10 part per million maximum contaminant level for drinking water. So that profile actually came from a study that we did in the management systems evaluation area back in the 1990s. We measured the gravimetric water content as shown here in this graph, and then measured also ammonia, which I was pretty surprised to see we have a fair amount of ammonia that's stored in the vadose zone. That dry weight nitrate-nitrogen in micrograms per gram or parts per million, and then easily can convert that dry weight equivalent to a pore water nitrate in milligrams per liter. As you can see, that very last point at around 20 feet was actually at the water table. So by the time we got to the water table, we were already at about 30 parts per million in the groundwater. So to me, this really illustrates how important it is to sample and study what's going on in the vadose zone, especially when we're trying to change management practices at the surface that reduce leaching. So not everyone is familiar with the management systems evaluation area. It was located just southwest of Shelton, Nebraska, out in the Central Platte Valley. Pretty sandy soils, silt loam and very sandy loam at the surface, a shallow water table approximately 20 feet below the surface. We had a lot of information that we collected from this study, and I just want to share a little bit about that as it relates to nitrate leaching. Overall, the study was to compare nitrate leaching under gravity or furrow irrigation, a modified gravity irrigation method called surge, and sprinkler irrigation. So most of us take for granted that center pivots are pretty common. I think most NRDs, you see a large number, most of the irrigators are using center pivots. But back in the 90s, there was still a lot of furrow and gravity irrigation that was going on. So this was to compare basically water use between different management practices and see how that affected nitrate leaching. And here's just a summary of that data. We looked at changes in shallow groundwater nitrate levels under the center pivot irrigated corn. Our control was the center pivot irrigated alfalfa field that received no fertilizer, and then compared that to changes in the shallow groundwater under conventional or gravity furrow irrigated corn and surge irrigated corn. And this just to focus in on the results of that study, we can see under the conventional and surge irrigated corn, we saw essentially no change in nitrate-nitrogen leaching below the surface, below the root zone. but we did see, or we were able to statistically find a reduction in nitrate-nitrogen leaching below the root zone and into the shallow water table. And the bar graphs show that we really had no effect to yield. We used much less water under the pivot irrigated field. So this was one of the first studies where we could actually confirm that using less water resulted in lower nitrate leaching rates. Well, this Vadose zone that we're studying across the state, not just at the management systems evaluation area, is really a place for temporary nitrate storage. This study was one of the first ones that I was aware of. One of my colleagues, Lisa Kitchen, was in graduate school at the same time as I was, and I helped her collect some of these samples. This just shows the correlation between the amount of nitrogen that was applied at the surface to the amount of vadose zone nitrate that was stored in the vadose zone. The water table at this location is fairly deep, almost 100 feet, and we had pretty fine textured sediments, 30% clay, over half was silt content, and we also had some sandy zones within this vadose zone that served as locations for accumulation of nitrate-nitrogen from fertilizer at the surface. If we convert those concentrations into the pore water equivalent, we can see that we have very high concentrations of pore water nitrate, at one point getting close to 80 milligrams per liter under the site that had received 400 pounds of N per acre. And this shows a graph of that same data. If under the control site, we had close to 100 pounds of N per acre. As we went up in terms of fertilizer application from 100 to 200 to 300 to 400 pounds of N per acre, we see a almost exponential increase in the amount of nitrate-nitrogen that was stored in the vadose zone. At the bottom of this slide, it shows the amount of precipitation and the irrigation that was applied on these test plots, close to, what is that, 27, 28, 38, oh, quite a bit of water was applied at this site. And this is one of the first studies where we start to get the idea that the amount of water that is applied is almost as important, if not more important, than the amount of fertilizer that's applied in terms of nitrate leaching. So one of the questions from many of these studies is how fast is nitrate traveling through the vadose zone? This is a subsequent study from the South Central Research and Extension Center, same site that Lisa Kitchens scored for her master's thesis. And they were able to correlate peaks in nitrate-nitrogen in the vadose zone between cores in 1985 and 1990. And this gives us an idea of the approximate transport rate on the order of 2 to 3 feet per year of some of these pulses of high nitrate nitrogen in the vadose zone. So this is a study where we were able to measure it, looking at the time series of nitrate peaks in the vadose zone. I'll show some other peaks like that from other sites. One of the most recent studies involved looking at the Hastings wellhead protection area. One of my graduate students, Craig Adams, collected some cores from 32 sites that had been previously cored in 2011, and it estimated changes in the quantity and distribution of Nitrate-N and other contaminants in the vadose zone. Craig sampled the entire vadose zone down to the water table and looked at differences in residential versus ag land uses and sites that had converted from gravity to pivot irrigation. nitrate-nitrogen storage. They concluded that conversion to pivot irrigation was leading to lower nitrate-nitrogen leaching rates. As shown in this graph, we do see an overall trend of lower nitrate-nitrogen in the pore water beneath the pivot irrigated corn and beans. These are all the core sites that, that Craig Adams cored for his master's project. As you can see from the table, over half the sites are pivot irrigation. There were 4 locations where we looked at gravity irrigation, as well as some residential urban sites and even some places where organic nitrogen would be important. Craig did a nice job of describing the Vadose zone. This shows a transect from the northwest to the southeast, ending in the city of Hastings. We see interbedded sands and gravels in the Vadose zone with a considerable amount of sand and clay. So these are relatively tight textured soils, sediments beneath the crop root zone, but we still see evidence for quite a bit of nitrate leaching through these Vadose zone sediments. Just a couple of examples of the nitrate profiles. This one is from a gravity irrigated field, comparing the 2011 totals to the 2016 totals. We saw at one side of the field relatively constant amount of nitrate-nitrogen stored in the Vadose zone. At the other end of the field, we saw almost 200% increase in the amount of nitrate-nitrogen stored in the Vadose zone. And these profiles kind of show the change with depth. Nitrate-nitrogen was pretty high even in 2011, and it increased by 200% at one of the 2 locations. If we look at the lower right-hand graph, the moisture content was relatively the same between 2011 and 2015. So it really just relates to the amount of moisture holding capacity of the sediments, but we are seeing evidence for nitrate transport even through these fine textured sediments. Here's an example of a pivot irrigated site, and contrary to what we might expect, we actually saw an increase at both locations for the pivot irrigated corn, almost 100% increase in nitrate-nitrogen, even under pivot irrigated corn. So overall, when we tabulate the amount of Vadose zone nitrate-nitrogen, we saw an average increase of approximately 50%. The red lines show where locations where we had a decrease, and the green text shows where we had an increase in the amount of nitrate-nitrogen that was stored. This is comparing 2011 to 2016 profiles and calculated in the top 60 feet. If we compare nitrate-nitrogen in the Vadose zone by depth and land use, we can see that the same or similar trends to what we found in the 2011 study. Residential sites tended to be the lowest in terms of the amount of nitrate-nitrogen stored in the top 65 feet. Pivot irrigated had the next highest at about 540 pounds of N per acre. And then that furrow irrigated land use, which is the minority of the sites that were cored, had the highest levels of nitrate stored in the Vadose zone. We just look under the cropland, which includes 23 of the 32 different sites, found an average of about 400 pounds of N per acre in 2011, increased to about 520 pounds of N per acre. So even under the pivot irrigation, we saw evidence for an overall increase in nitrate stored in the Vadose zone. We had a couple of locations where they had converted from a furrow irrigated to pivot irrigated. This is one of the sites where it was still furrow irrigated, and we saw the largest increase in the amount of nitrate-nitrogen stored, increased from about 400 to 1,400 pounds N per acre. This is at the head of a field where we would expect to see the greatest water use and likely find the greatest nitrate leaching rates. Converting from furrow to pivot irrigation occurred at 2 locations, and we found an average reduction of about 170 pounds N per acre in the top 60 feet under fields that had converted from high water use to a lower water use pivot irrigation. We also found some interesting trends of nitrate, or excuse me, of Ammonia-N, compared the amount of ammonia that was stored in the Vadose zone. Residential sites, about 200 pounds N per acre as ammonia. Pivot irrigated sites had about more than twice that amount, and then furrow had roughly twice the amount of N as ammonia stored in the Vadose zone. In addition to the coring, we did some modeling using some data that we collected from the cores, measuring hydraulic conductivity. We actually coupled 2 different models. One was the root zone water quality model that was put together by the USDA Ag Research Service. It simulates a water movement, plant growth, nutrient uptake, cycling in water, and predicts lost nitrate. And then we coupled that with a Hydrus 1D transport model, which basically just predicts how fast nitrate or water would move through the Vadose zone. Collected a lot of data from a variety of different sources. That's what this slide is showing us, and used hydraulic conductivity measurements to see what kind of profiles we might predict based on the sediment lithology. We calibrated those models using data from the Hastings wellhead protection study, and then compared nitrate transport rates under dryland crops, under gravity irrigated and pivot irrigated corn, and then analyzed the results statistically to generate simulations and estimate transport rates and travel times from the root zone to the water table. The model was tested in this study with a single fertilizer application rate of 160 pounds N per acre and 20 years worth of weather data. We found that the greatest mass of nitrate leached under furrow irrigation and the lowest, obviously, under dryland crop. This further supports the contention that using less water results in less nitrate leaching. We found the fastest movement under furrow irrigation, approximately 2.6 feet per year. Slowest under dryland crops was about 1 to 1.5 foot per year travel time. Total travel time with about 90 foot to the water table ranged between 30 and 45 years, and leaching rates were found to be similar to other studies. One caveat, I think, with using a model is we're averaging all of the soil parameters into and looking at homogeneous uniform flow. I suspect at many locations we're getting preferential flow. So these are really conservative estimates for transport times in the Vadose zone. So in summary, this Vadose zone below the crop root zone is really a dynamic reservoir of stored nitrogen, both as ammonia and nitrate-N. We find that greater nitrogen fertilizer or water application use results in more leached nitrate. Even where we have more efficient water application, we may see increases in Vadose zone nitrate that ultimately will reach the water table. We found through several studies statistically significant differences by land use. Gravity or furrow irrigation tends to result in the greatest nitrogen leaching. We find some leaching under pivot irrigated crops and the least amount under non-irrigated dryland crops. I would recommend that we encourage changing from furrow to pivot irrigation as a way to reduce nitrate and leaching beneath cropland, as it's clear from several studies that it can lead to a reduction in Vadose zone nitrate-N and ultimately reduce loading to the water table.